Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Don Hubin. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values. This event is part of the COMPAS program. COMPAS stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. We describe it as a year-long university-wide conversation on an issue that raises foundational moral questions but requires input from multiple disciplines to address. The theme of this year's COMPAS program is technology, the way it's affecting our lives, the moral implications of technology, the ways in which we interact with one another, and so forth. Today's topic is fake news. You might wonder why fake news is part of Technology Compass, because fake news has been around as long as humans have been around. But by my lights anyway, technologies have changed fake news in two ways, or the effect of fake news in two ways. One is what philosophers call verisimilitude, the ability to make something look real. It used to be kind of hard to make a publication look like the New York Times, but it's very easy in your garage or in your basement to make a website look like a professional, high-quality website. The other is the rapid dissemination of fake news. And of course, you've all heard the Jonathan Swift quote that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. You might actually have heard that quote attributed to Mark Twain, but an intensive 30-second Google search that I did today tells me that it's fake news that Mark Twain was the originator of that quote. Maybe a lie has always been able to move faster than the truth, but now it can move extremely fast around the world. To help us understand these issues better today, we have with us Brendan Nyhan, right? From the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. He has wide-ranging interests concerning how people form their beliefs based on exposure to information and misinformation. And he's done significant work on the effects of the so-called fake news on recent elections, which is the topic of today's talk, fake news in the 2016-2018 campaigns, prevalence, detection, and effects. Today's talk is made possible through the generosity of the Dreher family that funds the Dreher Chair in Political Communication and Policy Thinking, which is currently held by Professor Gregory Caldera, sitting here in the second row. And we're grateful to Professor Caldera for allowing the Center for Ethics and Human Values to organize this event. As always, I want to thank the people that make events like this be possible. That is our Associate Director, Steve Brown, who, as you can see, does more than Associate Direct. He also runs tech and a bunch of other things. And our two terrific staff people, Ali McCarthy and Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brendan Nyhan for what I am sure is going to be a very interesting talk. So, Brendan.
All right. Well, thanks very much. It's a real honor to be here. I appreciate everybody coming out. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is research that I've been working on pretty much since immediately after the 2016 campaign in different forms, trying to understand this phenomenon we call fake news, how many people actually saw it, and what effects it might have. Okay. So I want to first start by acknowledging all my co-authors. You can see this kind of science takes an army of social scientists, so many co-authors to be credited, as well as many funders who made this research possible. Okay, so what do we mean by fake news? This phenomenon came to our attention in the aftermath of the 2016 election when we learned that stories like these had actually been shared millions of times on Facebook. These are the 5 most widely shared fake news stories, according to Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed, in the period before the 2016 election. Characters, they're all false. People are looking at them in stunned disbelief. They are all false, and reflecting what the kinds of fake news that was circulating in the period before the election. They were all anti-Clinton or pro-Trump in orientation. Okay? Now, we didn't know exactly how many people saw these, but there were indications that the scope of this problem was greater than we had anticipated. So Silverman was able to give a kind of preliminary estimate of the aggregate distribution of this kind of content, where he had a list of articles that he classified as fake news from these for-profit publishers that were publishing dubious, slanted content that typically favored one of the two major candidates. And what he found was in the period before the 2016 election, immediately before, just those last few months, the most viral stories from these websites were shared more often than the most viral stories from mainstream news websites, according to people who'd made their sharing data public on Facebook. Okay. So you can see there was at least an indication of a substantial problem, right? Those sharing numbers are non-trivial, right? So if these articles were being shared, if these articles were shared 8.7 million times, and the people who shared those had a number of friends who were exposed to them, right? You can imagine, as you multiply through, the potential aggregate exposure to these articles that was taking place. Of course, this excludes the people who didn't make their Facebook sharing public, which is most people, right? So the scope of this problem was potentially significant. So there's a lot of reason for worry. Okay? At the same time, this tells us very little. Okay? Because these aggregate sharing statistics don't tell us who saw these, in what context, how did they get there, what were their prior beliefs, what effects did it have, right? All the sorts of questions we've been asking since the election itself. Okay? And those are the kinds of questions that we'd like to answer, because it turns out we were lucky enough to be in the field with a different kind of study in this same period, and so we can say something much more precise about who is actually consuming articles from fake news websites, okay, and what effect it might have had on them. And we've done some follow-up research in the period since. So that's what I hope to be able to answer for you today, is to give you a much more precise sense of this phenomenon. How important is it, and what effects does it have, and what effect? Okay? So that's really the goal here today, is to convince you, to give you a sense of what social science can tell us about the prevalence and importance of this phenomenon. But I want to underscore the reason why we care about it. Okay, what are the stakes here? Right? Why does this matter? I think what really the stakes are about how we think about information provision in a democracy. We've increasingly been talking about this idea of echo chambers. There's been a concern expressed for a number of years now, famously, for instance, by Cass Sunstein at Harvard Law School, that people are in echo chambers, that they're in digital technology is enabling them to differentially consume information that coincides with their political preferences. Okay? Now, that's a claim that is more that is mostly based on anecdotes to this point. Okay, it's important to underscore that. But what I think has worried people so much about fake news is the idea that rather than being in echo chambers of opinion, people might be in echo chambers of fact, or fact-like claims that seem to coincide with their political preferences. And that might be much worse, right? It's one thing if you're simply hearing from other people who share your opinions about what the best political what best political party is, what the best public policy is, and so forth. It's another thing if they're telling you things that are false about the world, right? That play on your vulnerabilities as a supporter of a political party or a political candidate. Okay, so I think the stakes here are potentially significant, and that's why people have cared so much. But I also want to caution you against what I see as something of a kind of moral panic that's emerged over fake news in the period since the 2016 election. And the context I would offer here is the kinds of worries that people expressed in the aftermath of the development of radio and television about mass propaganda, okay? Most of which were not supported by subsequent social science. Okay? It's not to say radio and television aren't important. Of course they are. But their effects on public opinion are far more nuanced than people feared at the time. Okay? And I'm going to argue to you today the same is true of fake news and of internet, things you see on the internet and social media more generally. Okay? What I'm showing up here, by way of context, is the famous references to the famous War of the Worlds hoax, okay? Which, appropriately enough for this talk, was actually the panic it supposedly induced is actually itself a kind of hoax. Okay? It was actually overhyped. You should go Google this if you don't believe me. But the newspaper industry actually overhyped this as a way to attack radio, which was a competing communication medium at the time. Okay? So the evidence that people were terrified and running around in a panic is actually not well substantiated. But there was this secondary kind of panic over it that was stirred up by people who had an interest in playing to those fears. Okay? And I think a similar story may apply here. Okay? And so what we need to do is go beyond the anecdotes we've all heard that are scary and think more carefully about how much of a problem is this really? Right? Is it having the effects people assume? Okay? And as I'm going to show you, the picture is a lot more nuanced than the conversation immediately after the 2016 election would suggest. Okay, so what I'd like to show you today is evidence about how much fake news people are exposed to, whether the prevalence of fake news changed in the last election, in the 2018 midterm election, compared to the 2016 presidential election. Do people actually believe these stories? We can see that they're consuming them, but are they actually believing them? Who's believing them? What effects does exposure to those articles have? And how are people getting to them in the first place? Okay? And because I don't believe in murder mystery talks, let me just tell you right from the beginning, it's actually a relatively small number of people who are consuming most of what we describe as fake news. And I'll talk to you more about how we're defining that in a moment. Okay, so it turns out that the people who consume fake news are overwhelmingly people who already consume a heavily skewed diet of news, political news and information that coincides with their political preferences. Okay? So that's inconsistent with the story of people who are indifferent, who don't know very much about politics, and are just persuaded to support one side or the other because they saw fake news. As I'll show you in a moment using quite granular data, those kinds of people didn't actually consume very much fake news at all. This is much more a story of people who consume lots and lots of political news that coincides with their preferences, also consuming this kind of dubious political news that supports their preferences. And that changes the whole story in terms of why we might worry about this. It doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about it, but it changes the story in some really important ways. Okay? We show the prevalence of fake news consumption goes down in 2018, although that story about who's consuming it remains constant. We can show you that it's a minority of people who believe these stories, but it's going to be greater when those stories are congenial to your political point of view, as you'd expect. We find when we experimentally expose people to single fake news articles, no measurable effects on a range of outcomes you might worry about in terms of changing people's minds or them becoming more polarized. Finally, we find that Facebook is the most important vector of fake news distribution, supporting the media reporting that you've seen in the period since the 2016 election. However, that relationship goes away in 2018, suggesting that the countermeasures the platform has taken since the 2016 election have at least been somewhat effective. Okay, so the framework you should be thinking about here, okay, the kind of theoretical way that social scientists would think about a problem like this is when you're talking about this highly inflammatory political content that some people might really like because it's supporting or opposing candidates that they have strong feelings about, is what's called selective exposure. Okay? And the idea here is that people tend to prefer, at least to some extent, to consume news and information that coincides with their point of view, and maybe to a lesser extent to avoid counter-attitudinal information that is inconsistent with their predispositions or point of view. Okay? So this is the kind of force that echo chamber critiques worry about. The wrinkle, though, is that when we've gotten better behavioral data, seeing what people actually do in the real world, we've found that those tendencies are differentially expressed by a minority of people. So we all have a kind of small tendency in that direction to prefer things that coincide with our point of view. Okay? But the prevalence of that tendency in people's real-world political news consumption behavior is pretty limited, okay? With the exception of a minority of people who have a very intense preference for that kind of political news and consume a lot of it, okay? So they're a relatively small percentage of the population, but they're a big fraction of the political news audience, right? Think of the people you know who consume the most political news. I would submit to you they often have very strong preferences, and they often have more skewed diets of news and information than the average person. Okay? So what are we going to do in this study to try to understand who's consuming fake news? That's the kind of theoretical framework we're going to be applying here. We're interested in this tendency for people to seek out political news information that coincides with their point of view. Right? That might be a story about how we can understand who is consuming fake news. But we also know that it's a subset of people who do this the most. Okay? So we're going to see what that data looks like for fake news using a combination of 3 different kinds of data. Okay? So we had a study in the field in fall of 2016 that had a series of standard survey measures asking people about things like which candidate they supported, which party they identified with, and so forth. Okay. For those same people, the survey company that we hired was able to recruit these folks to also install, with their informed consent, anonymized tracking of their web traffic. Okay, so they have software installed on their computer that allows us, the researchers, to see the websites that they visit on their laptop or desktop computer. Okay? So rather than ask them, did you read fake news? which of course can founder because people don't remember which websites they visited, and their definitions of fake news may vary, and on and on and on. We have an objective measure of the information they consume. Okay? Two important caveats here. The mobile tracking data is not very good. The patterns I'm going to show you are broadly consistent on the mobile tracking data, but few of our respondents have that product installed, and it's less granular in the data we can observe. We only observe the domains they visit, not the pages. Okay, so I'm not going to show you those results. We put less weight on them. These are the results I'll be showing you are from laptop and desktop computers. The second caveat is we don't have the magical super secret Facebook data. No one does except for Facebook, and they're not sharing it with anyone. So I can't tell you what people saw in their news feed. Okay? What I can tell you instead that's novel about the data I'm going to show you is the people who actually visited one of these fake news websites themselves. Okay? So these websites, let me just build a story here of what I mean by fake news. Okay, the way we're going to define fake news, these are for-profit websites that popped up in the period before the 2016 election that often publish factually dubious content favoring one of the two major candidates. Okay? So it's not all false information anywhere online. It's not all false information in the world, right? It's this particular brand of website that tried to make money by publishing this inflammatory, often false, or misleading content. Okay? And to do that, what they had to do was attract people to their websites, okay, to sell, so they could show ads. Okay? So they used Facebook as a distribution mechanism, but they had to get people to the website to actually make money. Okay? And so what we're going to see is who actually interacted with this content enough to get to the website itself. We can't see what's in the news feed. Okay. And then we'll get to this in a moment. Okay. So the data I'm going to be showing you are from fall of 2016 and fall of 2018. Okay. So we're going to see what did fake news consumption and exposure look like in the 2016 election, and then we're going to have a comparison in the 2018 election as well. Okay. So what do we find? Okay. In 2016, only about 1 in 4 Americans went to one of these fake news websites at all. Okay. On average, Americans read 5.5 articles. They visited 5.5 articles on these websites that published these dubious news reports, so pseudo news reports that were frequently fact-checked and found to be false. Okay, but that's going to be, as I'm going to show you, a misleading statistic because it's really a small number of people are consuming a lot of this content. Okay? It turns out the average person doesn't consume very much of it at all, right? So if you're worried, all people were reading about politics in the period before the 2016 election fake news, the answer is no, right? It only made up about 2.5% of the web pages they visited focused on hard news topics. Now, it is true, consistent with that story I told you earlier about selective exposure, that people tended to consume fake news that favored their preferred candidate. So what you're looking at here is the percentage of Trump supporters and Clinton supporters who visited websites we classified as pro-Trump or pro-Clinton. And you can see Trump supporters overwhelmingly favored pro-Trump fake news sites. Now, pro-Trump fake news sites were so much larger and reached so many more people that even Clinton supporters visited them more. But you can see the differential is much smaller than for the Trump supporters. Okay? So they had a relative preference for the pro-Clinton fake news, although they still consumed it a little bit less. Okay? And you can get a sense of the magnitudes, right? So 40% of Trump supporters visited at least one pro-Trump fake news site in this period before the 2016 election. Okay? Well, but you might say, but that might have been a website they looked at for 2 seconds, right? So how meaningful was this interaction? Okay? And so that's where I would direct you here, where we're looking at the percentage of their overall news consumption, how much of it came from these fake news sites. And you can see that for everyone except the Trump supporters, the number is absolutely negligible, and it's only about 4%. It's only about 4% for Trump supporters for that pro-Trump fake news. Okay, so it's small in general, and really only the pro-Trump fake news was a meaningful percentage of anyone's information diet. Okay, in 2018, those numbers drop. So the patterns remain quite consistent. We're looking now at those same domains. In 2018, they only retain a fraction of their audience, you can see, and it's mostly Republicans who are visiting them. You can see it's virtually 0 for Democrats. Pro-Clinton fake news sites not doing so well in the period, in this period, right? Some of them are still continuing to publish anti-Republican, pro-Democrat content, but they're reaching very few people, right? Only about 7% of Americans went to one of these sites at all in the period before the 2018 election, okay? And it makes up a tiny fraction of people's news diets. So again, it's not clear that this is information that's just saturating people's news diets in the way the hype might suggest. Okay? I can give you some more granular evidence on the decline in fake news consumption here by tracking a number of these studies we've collected using similar methods. What percentage of people at these different time intervals went to at least one of these fake news sites. And you can see relative to 2016, the data I just showed you is what's called the 2016 definition here. There's a clear decline in the percentage of Americans going to at least one of these sites after 2016. Right? So that could be people's diminished interest in politics. Right? The 2016 election was a focusing event. Presidential elections are more salient than midterm elections. It also could be the case that the countermeasures taken by Facebook have made it harder for those publishers to reach a wide audience, right? Because as I'm going to show you a little bit later, Facebook played a critical role in them attracting a large audience. Now, you might worry that the list of websites we were using based on what we saw in the 2016 election has gone out of date. So we used an updated definition that I can go into the details of if you like, but it's a fresh set of domains based on more recent consumption data, and we still see that same consistent decline pattern with that second set of definitions as well. Okay, so using both definitions, that story is clear. In terms of the amount of fake news people consume as a fraction of their information diet, the results are a little more mixed. It's clearly negative with that first definition. It's more flat with the second. Okay, so I would consider those to be encouraging results if you're worried about how much fake news people are consuming. I wouldn't declare victory yet, though, because the real test will be the 2020 election, right? Again, it may have been that the midterm election was a more favorable context for the platforms to fight fake news. In 2020, when interest in politics is higher and people have those strong negative feelings that presidential elections elicit, that may be when we see a resurgence of interest in and consumption of fake news. Okay. Now, I told you earlier that it seems like people really differ in how much they want to read information that coincides with their political preferences and predispositions. Okay? And we're going to try to get at that in our data. Okay? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take all the respondents in our data set, and we're going to estimate the average slant of the websites they visit. Okay? So what I mean by that is we have an estimate from Facebook's data science team of the slant of a large number of frequently visited websites. The way they compute that is basically they say sites that are overwhelmingly shared on Facebook by self-identified liberals versus conservatives score as very liberal on this measure. Sites like Daily Kos, if you've heard of that, the Huffington Post, and so forth. Sites that are overwhelmingly shared by self-identified conservatives relative to liberals, like Fox News and Breitbart, are scored as very conservative by this measure. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to take that, and we're going to average the slant of all the websites that people go to during the period we observe them. Okay? So we're going to get an average slant of the websites you visit that's based on this sharing data from Facebook. Okay? And once we do that, we're going to divide the population into deciles based on the average slant of their media diet. So what that means here is as you move from left to right, this is the 10% of Americans with the most liberal information diets, all the way over to the 10% of Americans with the most conservative information diets. Okay? So what we're doing now is we're saying who consumed fake news based on how does that correspond to their overall information diet. Okay? And this is a measure of binary exposure. Did they go to at least one of those fake news sites in the period before the 2016 election? Okay? And what I hope you can see here is that the story is consistent with what I told you earlier. That's really these people who have strong preferences for a certain kind of news and information that coincides with their point of view, who are consuming the most fake news, right? So for pro-Clinton fake news, which is in white, you can see as you move out here to the left, for the Americans who have the most liberal information diets, right, that's when consumption of pro-Clinton fake news starts to really increase in these two most liberal deciles here. The same pattern applies for pro-Trump fake news, but to an even greater extent. As you move out to the 9th and especially the 10th decile, we see this massive surge in the percentage of people who visited at least one of these pro-Trump fake news sites, more than 60% in that 10th decile. Okay. The story is even more stark when we look at the percentage of people's information that comes from one of these sites. And here you can see the pro-Clinton sites made up a negligible fraction of anyone's information diet, irrespective of their overall information consumption patterns. Okay? Pro-Trump fake news, by contrast, made up a small but important fraction of people's news and information diets, especially for the 8th, 9th, and 10th decile. Okay, so the 30% of Americans with the most conservative information diets, right, it made up a much larger share of their news and information consumption. Okay? And even this graph understates the extent to which this is driven by the 10% of folks out here, okay, because they consume much more political news than people in the middle of the distribution. Okay? So they're consuming, we estimate in this 2016 period, about 60% of all the fake news consumption that we observe is coming from the 10% of Americans with the most conservative news diets out here. Okay. So what does this tell us? Right? So if you're worried about fake news influencing the results of the 2016 election, what you have to do is look at this and tell me how fake news is convincing these folks to vote for Hillary Clinton, right? And I'm not sure that's an easy case to make, right? So this, empirically, I can tell you these folks overwhelmingly prefer Donald Trump. Okay? It's hard to imagine a story where this is changing their vote. Okay? I'll show you some evidence that there's no. I'll summarize some results on this point later. But for now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that if you're worried about effects on who people vote for, you'd be thinking about these folks here in the middle of the distribution, and they're consuming very little fake news at all. Okay? So it's not obvious why there would be big persuasive effects from fake news looking at these data. Okay. The 2018 data look very similar. There's no evidence that those 2016 results are anomalous. The patterns are a little bit weaker, consistent with what I told you earlier, that fewer people were consuming fake news and that overall volumes of consumption were down. Same pattern applies, though, really concentrated in that 10th decile, okay, in terms of how many people went to at least one site, and then here, the fraction of people's news diets that came from these fake news sites. Okay, so do people believe this stuff, right? So I'd say the number one question I get when I talk about fake news is people saying, yeah, but they don't actually believe it, okay? Like the youth version of this is they're sharing it for the lulz, right? They're kind of showing, like, ha, 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 look how funny this is, right? And it's not obvious that's true. Silverman did a survey right after the election where he showed people a bunch of fake news stories and asked if they'd seen it, and of those ones who said they had, asked if they thought it was true. And most of the people who claimed to have seen these articles in his survey indicated they did believe that these stories were accurate. So it's not obvious that everyone is just sharing these to troll each other or to laugh at how stupid they are or whatever, okay? Another piece of auxiliary evidence I can offer you, right? So I would say some people, we've all had the experience of opening the junk website and then frantically closing it as we realize it's terrible, right? That's not what we observe here, right? So in fact, we find that people spent longer on the fake news websites than on hard news websites about hard news topics. They were actually on the pages longer, right? Which is a kind of auxiliary measure that they seem to actually be reading or engaging with it in some way. Okay, but here we can get a much more direct measure. So in follow-up studies, these are follow-up studies conducted in the fall of 2018, we showed people a bunch of fake news articles that had been fact-checked and found to be false or misleading. And we asked people, when they saw the headline in a Facebook-style preview, whether they thought it was accurate or not. What you can see is that on average, between 50 and 32% of people thought these stories were accurate. So it's not that everyone's falling for them, but there is a minority of people who are believing they're true. And that effect, not surprisingly, is concentrated on the stories that are politically congenial to your point of view. Okay? So we all have this tendency to believe things more that coincides with what we'd like to be true. Okay? It's as high as 48% for one of these headlines. Okay? What does this look like overall? Okay? So the good news is that people can distinguish between fake and so-called real news here, meaning articles from legitimate mainstream news organizations. Okay? They do rate the legitimate mainstream news headlines as more accurate than the ones from fake news websites or the kind of middle category so-called hyper-partisan publishers. Okay? But in each case, they rate those stories that are congenial to their partisanship as more accurate than the ones that aren't. Right? So you can see this increase in the perceived accuracy of fake news when it's congenial to people's partisanship, and that same pattern applies to the hyper-partisan sites as well as the real news articles as well. So the vulnerability here is going to be those stories that coincide with people's preferences. Okay, how do people get to these fake news sites? So in 2016, the reporting suggested it was Facebook, and the answer that comes screaming out of our data is, in fact, Facebook. Okay? So you won't be surprised to hear that, but we think this is some of the best evidence available outside of the company. Okay? And it's consistent with the reporting as well. Right? When journalists have asked the fake news publishers, how did you reach people, they would say, we went on Facebook and posted it there. Right? So this was not like some mystery or secret, but we can provide some objective evidence of how important Facebook was in aiding the dissemination of these sites. Okay? And the way we did that, again, we can't see into the Facebook server rooms. So what we're doing instead is we're trying to infer when Facebook was the referring website. Okay? And the way we do that is we say, when people visited one of these fake news articles, had they previously been in the prior 30 seconds in the prior up to 3 websites they had visited, did Facebook appear in that list? And then we compare that to websites focusing on hard news topics that we don't classify as fake news, as well as other kinds. And what we see is Facebook differentially stands out as appearing just before people load one of these fake news sites in 2016 in a pattern that's not observed for hard news, even though Facebook's an important source of hard news website traffic. Pattern's not observed for Google. Pattern's not observed for Twitter. The list goes on. Okay, so it seems like, and if you expand that window from 30 seconds, because of course, sometimes if you interact with Facebook, you're scrolling through that news feed for quite a while. So you may not have reloaded a URL on Facebook.com for more than 30 seconds. Okay? So this is arguably an undercount of the role of Facebook. But as that window expands out, it's harder for us to know if they were the referring website or not. Now, the good news is in 2018, that pattern goes away. Okay? Now, I can't tell you if that's something about the countermeasures taken by the publisher, the lack of interest people have in fake news, in sharing it with their friends on Facebook, or something else. We can't say with our data, but what I can tell you is that pattern is no longer observed. So we take that as at least an encouraging sign that social media is amplifying the effects of this content out and helping it reach millions of people to the same extent it did in 2016. Now it looks like other forms of content, which is an improvement. Okay, so what effect did fake news have on the 2016 election? You've probably seen headlines like this out there in the world suggesting that Donald Trump won the election because of fake news. Okay? Now, in social science, or in science generally, the best way to test this would be some sort of randomized experiment. I didn't run that. I'm not sure any institutional review board would let me run that. So what I can do instead is tell you what I think is the next best answer, which comes from our data. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to compare people's candidate preference in July of 2016, before fake news took off, with November. And we're going to say, between July and November, did the people who consume pro-Trump fake news differentially shift towards supporting him? And we're also going to say, conditional on your turnout behavior in 2016, whether you voted or not, were you more likely to turn out? Whether you turned out or voted, whether you turned out in 2012, were you differentially more likely to turn out in 2016 if you consumed pro-Trump fake news? Okay? And the answer in every case is we find no measurable relationship. Okay? So we find no measurable change in candidate preference relative to what the candidates people already indicated supporting, or their prior preference in July, prior to the takeoff of fake news. We find no differential association between fake news exposure and turnout in 2016, conditional on your turnout in 2012 and a range of control variables. I'm happy to show you a horrible-looking table that shows you the full list. And finally, both of these relationships do not vary by how much fake news you consume, where I do a dose-response model, splitting people by people who consumed a lot of fake news or not that much. Okay, it's a median split on how much fake news you consume. In all these cases, we find no measurable association. Okay, so again, it's not obvious that this was having a persuasive or mobilizing effect. Now, the election was close enough that I can't rule out elaborate stories about how it moved 50,000 votes in this Midwestern state and 20,000 in that other state. But I would say what we know, both these findings and what we know generally about how hard it is to change people's minds and how hard it is to get people to vote, suggests it's not likely to be responsible for changing the results. Okay. Now, so if that's the case, what are we worried about? Well, we might be worried instead not about persuasion, but we might be worried about the ways that fake news makes us hate the other side. Right? I'd say this is the thing I'm most worried about. Right? So you take these folks who already have a really strong preference for news that coincides with their political preferences. Okay, so they're highly politically engaged. They're consuming a lot of political news that's going to be coinciding with what they already believe about the world. And now they're hearing terrible, terrible things about how awful the other side is, how evil they are, the murders they're committing, or whatever it is. Is that inflaming their feelings against the other side and making them hate them more? Okay. So we randomly showed people terrible, terrible fake news stories in an experiment with appropriate permission from our institutional review board, suggesting that the Trump administration had, and they were debriefed afterward to make sure they didn't believe that this stuff was true, suggesting the Trump administration had basically aided in the Saudis in targeting Khashoggi, and that George Soros was behind the caravan. Okay, so inflammatory stuff, really strong stuff. Okay, afterwards, if you see this, you're more likely to say it's true, but we found no measurable effect on vote intention, which party they intended to vote for in the 2018 election, affective polarization, their negative feelings towards the other party, which is what we were especially worried about. A range of kind of activism and mobilization measures were also null. The only thing we found an effect on was people saying they were more likely to vote. But that actually happened regardless of whether the fake news article they saw coincided with their party preference or was its opposite. So it seems to have just kind of been a kind of political content that activated people more than any kind of a polarizing effect. Okay, so I don't want to suggest we're out of the woods yet here or there's nothing to worry about. So let me give you a list of things you should still worry about, and then I'm going to wrap up, and I'd love to hear your questions. Okay, so this is the first step in this kind of research, not the last. There's lots of things we might still worry about. So one thing we might worry about is, even though these folks, as I've told you, right, it's relatively few people who are consuming this kind of content, they may in turn be disseminating it to people they know. Okay? This is what's called two-step flows here, right? So Tom reads his stuff and he tells all his friends, right? And even though most people don't consume this kind of content, they may hear about it from those kinds of people in their social networks. Okay? So the fact that we're not observing most people going to these websites doesn't mean it's not reaching people in this more indirect way. That's something to be looked at in the future. Okay? Another concern is the kinds of folks we're talking about who consume lots and lots of political news. They vote more frequently, and they're likely to engage in a range of participatory behaviors that might make them differentially influential in the political system. They might be more likely to volunteer for a campaign, to write letters to the editor, to contact their congressman, and so forth. Right? And so in that way, even though it's a relatively small percentage of the population, they might have a more outsized effect than their numbers would suggest. Okay. I also can't tell you the effect of seeing this kind of content over and over and over again. Okay? One story that people tell me is that when you see this stuff over time, it has a kind of cumulative effect. Okay? Our data just simply can't tell us what that sort of effect looks like, okay? But it's possible. And then finally, I think the thing that I'm most worried about is simply what this does to our discourse itself. Right? When so much of our political discourse is devoted to making and then debunking false claims, right? And how that distorts the debate over public policy, how it mars the images of candidates who are unfairly targeted, and so forth, right? So regardless of whether anyone changes their vote, we should worry about the health of our democratic discourse if this kind of content is pervasive, okay? But with all of that said, I would just encourage you to be careful about buying into all the hype around fake news, okay? Especially because I worry that it's going to make people paranoid that this stuff is everywhere, right? I've just told you how rare it is for people to consume this stuff. If you believe it's everywhere, people may start questioning legitimate forms of news and information that we need them to put some trust into. Doesn't mean that what you get from the mainstream media is perfect, but it can be quite corrosive if people don't believe anything. That's what happens in countries where the kind of political debate has really broken down, right? There's this kind of corrosive distrust that can set in. That's something we really want to avoid. And then finally, I would just say we should think about if fake news is such a small percentage of people's news and information diets, if you're worried about misinformation, if you're worried about this stuff because it's false, you should be even more worried about the misinformation coming from our political elites, which reaches vastly more people, right? The President of the United States has made more than 9,000 false claims since taking office, okay? He is the most covered man in the world, right? So the exposure to false claims in the President of the United States is just orders of magnitude larger. And that applies to any major figure in national politics, relative to these kinds of websites. So I think it's really important to reorient and to use data to think about where our democratic values are most obviously and directly threatened. It doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about these sorts of sites because they could represent something that could get much worse in the future, but I don't think that danger is here yet. Thanks. All right, yes, sir.
Isn't the most important democratic value that we have honest elections? That is, that the votes are counted as cast by the voter. Isn't the most significant issue, fake news issue, and political science issue, is are we getting, is the public being told what the scientifically conducted exit polls say how people voted versus what the fudged results are done afterwards to speak on the assumption that American elections can't be rigged. So whatever the electronic machines report, that's the actual votes. We adjust.
There's no evidence of widespread election fraud or tabulation. We can have that argument another day, but I'll just say that there is absolutely no evidence of widespread election fraud. Doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about the security of our election system. There's a range of political science experts who can tell you all about those problems, but I don't believe that there's any evidence of widespread election fraud or manipulation. Yes, sir, in the back.
Question about your last comment about Donald Trump.
Sure. One story that you might worry about is that this kind of content gets funneled through elites and then back out to the public. There's some evidence of Russian trolls on Twitter also getting retweeted by elites back out to larger audiences. So there can be this kind of bank shot effect to the wider public. I don't know the magnitudes of that. I think most of the claims on that list of Trump falsehoods are things he said extemporaneously, not tweets or false news or whatever. But it's certainly something I would say if you were worried. Let's go back to my point here for a moment about differential influence, right? If this kind of dubious content, and let's not even say limit it to the fake news sites, but these hyper-partisan sites, this broader set of sites, right? If those are widely read in activist circles, right, and those activists have the ear of political elites, for whom those activists are an important part of their base, right, then they could have a real influence, again, despite reaching a relatively niche audience. Yes, ma'am, please.
I'm just a little bit confused about your study. What was the demographics of the people that you were doing the study?
It's approximately nationally representative, so it should mirror the U.S. population. In the paper, the version of the paper that's online, which I'm happy to send you if you want to talk afterwards, it approximately mirrors the U.S. population.
Is this people that own the form of technology?
So let me go through the details. So this is the way it works. So it's an online survey. Thank you for asking that. It's an online survey firm called YouGov. Okay? So in the era of cell phones, no one answers their phones anymore. So unfortunately, regular polling is in the process of breaking down. So I don't answer my phone either, unfortunately. It's a real problem. So the old days was we would just randomly call phone numbers, and we would build a set of people that looked like the public as a whole. Okay? That's now breaking down because no one answers the phone. And so one of the premier firms in this space is the one we use called YouGov. What they do is they get a bunch of people to take surveys online. And they get a bunch of characteristics of those folks. And they build an approximation of a nationally representative sample matching a kind of gold standard from the US government doing super expensive surveys. Okay? So they build this set of people from online surveys who look like the public as a whole. You're right that they're going to use technology a little bit more because they're taking an online survey. But you can take it on phones, so you're starting to get almost everybody, okay, at that point. Let me just say one more thing. And then we're going to recruit people to install this tracking technology. So I'd say that the group this survey is going to be most representative of is a set of folks who have a laptop or desktop computer. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Right. Okay, so two things. So one would be this question of how believable are these claims? And the second would be, what about people who are hearing them different ways? You're right. So word of mouth is very hard to study. So I can't tell you what people are hearing by word of mouth in any specific way or link it to the websites that their friends saw or whatever. That's very difficult, but it would be important. Like, I don't mean to undersell your point. It's absolutely right. The second point in terms of what's believable, I guess, is really in the eye of the beholder, right? So your prior beliefs, right? These things may not be believable, but as you saw, let me put it back up. FBI agent who exposed Hillary Clinton's cover-up found dead. Mike Pence stealing campaign funds to pay his mortgage like a thief, right? So depends on your priors about Hillary Clinton or Mike Pence, right? So if you think those people are terrible and you're pretty credulous, you might think this stuff is true. Let me add one more wrinkle, though. One thing I haven't talked about is what are the other characteristics of people who are likely to believe this stuff. And one thing that comes through in all the different studies that have been done of fake news across Twitter and Facebook and web browsing in our data is senior citizens seem to have been one of the most vulnerable groups. And we can talk about the reasons for that. But one possible reason is a lack of digital literacy. That's harder for folks who came to technology late in life to pick up those cues about how credible this stuff is, right? So if you're a kind of sophisticated person who's grown up with technology, as the students here are for the most part, right? There's a set of cues you can kind of pick up as you go to these sites. You're like, oh, that looks like a kind of junky site. Now, as Don said in his introduction, they're getting better at looking realistic, but some people seem to be better at picking up those cues than others. Yes, sir.
Do you worry about the possibility of fake news turning violent? Like, for instance, think about the Pizzagate, the pizza conspiracy, the guy fronting on the pizza shop. Do you worry that might happen more in the future?
I think it's something we have to worry about. I'm not sure on frequency, but the Pizzagate thing is real, and it's a good counterpoint when we go back to the list of why should we worry. Another reason is a single person can pick up a gun and go to a pizza shop or start mailing bombs to famous politicians or whatever it is, right? So if violent extremists seize on this kind of content, that can be very dangerous. You might also think about other countries where political violence is closer to the surface or where armed conflict could be incited, right? So if you've been following the news from India right now, right, that's a country that's had a history of political violence erupting. They're in a period right before an election, and they're in something of an exchange of an escalation of tensions and hostilities with Pakistan, and both of them have nuclear weapons, and there's a ton of misinformation circulating there, right? So in some ways, we may be less vulnerable to some of the most negative consequences of this kind of content, But you're certainly you're absolutely right that we're not immune from them. Yeah, Tom.
So, on the one hand, I love the way you frame the story insofar as like the fake news panic is like propagated by journalists because they're in the business of daily attention. But I guess I have a little bit of hesitation insofar as this does fit also into like this thread of as social scientists, as our measures improve, like the things that we used to assume about people. And so, to the extent that the huge, very widely cited books in political science of the last decade about markets prior to news media markets, better sorting. Like insofar as now we have awesome measures on social media place, where the online news media consumption place, where it's easiest to sort, and there's almost no sorting. Like the APSR from Martin on Roll Sinclair buying into like local news media markets, and the audience not changing the channel after Sinclair buys a local news media affiliate. Like, what role does political science play in like taking things we should have measured and instead just making assumptions, spending a decade talking about them, and then walking back afterwards and saying, "Oops, it's not like everything we thought."
Yeah, no, I think yeah, and it's not specific. I would say communications is in the same boat here, right? So social science, I would say, when we had very limited data, right? The way we measured this stuff, let me just build back up to kind of bring people up to speed if you haven't followed, the last decade or so of political science on mass media consumption. The way these kinds of studies were done in the past is we would say, which of these articles would you like to read? Right? And we'd say, in a survey, would you like to read this article or this article, right? And asked in that context, lots of us would say, oh, I'd like to pick that article. And that article that we picked often was the one that coincided with our preferences. And so we inferred that that was the pattern of behavior in people's everyday lives. And that assumption carried through decades of research until we found out that there were these kind of there was this huge heterogeneity in how much people actually put that into practice in their everyday life. Because if you think about it, of course, the news information you encounter, it happens in lots of different ways and with lots of different motivations, right? So you might not pick Fox News or MSNBC depending on your partisanship, but you walk into a coffee shop, right, and one of them's on, right? Or you're flipping the channels and you happen to land there, right? Or et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a million kinds of ways. Or you're Googling something and you happen to see it, right? And once you add all those different ways that news and information consumption happens, right, it turns out this kind of behavior, this kind of systematic, mainlining of political content seems to be more. The thing I don't think we don't know, though, Tom, is how much this was happening at this kind of super hobbyist, like I follow politics almost as a vocation, as an amateur, how much that was happening in a less polarized era. I mean, there always have been political junkies, but if you are a political junkie now, you can just bathe in this stuff, right? 24/7, right? And I mentioned the senior citizens before, and I don't mean to pick on the senior citizens, but like if you're really interested in politics and you're retired, you just have more time to follow this stuff, right? So the cable news channels that are running this political content all day long, I don't know if you looked recently, but the people who watch them are really, really old, really old. Like the median viewer of cable news is like 65, median viewer, right? So that's why if you watch it, all the ads are about products for senior citizens, right? Because that's the audience, right? So that's all just to say there may be something here, but I think there are young people like that too, right? Who are just mainlining this kind of content, right? So there's a kind of person now who can do that. So those folks there in that 10th decile I described to you earlier, who are just consuming tons and tons of this, right? I think in our 5 or 6 week period, they were consuming on average, 600 hard news articles or something, just in the browser. That doesn't include what's on Facebook. That doesn't include what's on their phone. That doesn't include all the other stuff they saw in the newspaper and the radio and everything else, just in their browser, okay? So that heterogeneity, I think, is huge. And so what that does is it drives this big polarization in the news audience, because those small groups of people consume so much news that the audience that the reporters interact with and that the politicians interact with looks much more polarized, because those folks are just everywhere, seemingly. Yeah.
I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of Facebook in this debate, since you should sort of say these marginal for-profit websites probably don't have that much bigger effect, but you would think about what Facebook could do if they changed their strategy and what are their commercial incentives to actually help. Because you think about China and how social media is handled there, you could imagine a whole different set of effects if a company like Facebook changed their attitude towards discrimination.
Yeah, the Facebook issue is complicated. So full disclosure, they've funded research I'm doing on WhatsApp misinformation in India. I received $0 personally, but they're paying for research, so you should know that. In terms of their incentives, so what the reporting suggests is that part of what Facebook needed to do as a business, right? Their profit engine are those ads that they're showing you. And the way that they can sell lots of ads is show people lots of ads. And the way to show people lots of ads is to get you engaging with Facebook a lot, right? And part of the way they did that was first they tried to get people posting status updates, but they kind of maxed that out. We kind of ran out of baby pictures and pictures of our dog and stuff. So then they started pushing news, right? So there's this move when they really start pushing news, and this huge fire hose of traffic starts going to all the news websites because Facebook is elevating news and showing it to people. And so sharing news via Facebook becomes a thing. So they have a real economic incentive to do that, to drive time on site. And eventually that audience becomes so large and attractive that all these folks rush in, right? So it's not just that the mainstream publishers are trying to attract Facebook traffic, it's that the shady publishers can rush in. And the barriers to entry are almost zero. Right? So it turns out like it's really hard to get on TV. It's really hard to have a distributed print publication. It's really easy to have a website and put it onto Facebook. And if your story goes viral, it looks just the same as all the other stories in the feed. Right? So, and you can create that website for $1,000, $500. Right? And so people all over the world start creating these. So afterwards, I think the reputational cost got significant for Facebook, and they started dialing this back. And they've dialed back news in general. And it's going to cost them money. So do you remember the ad where it's like the birthday and we're going to go show you the things that make you love Facebook again and whatever? That was them signaling, or so they claim, that they're actually showing you more of that stuff and less news in general. I think we should be really worried about this. I mean, I guess the thing I would just say, your China example was on point. We're giving one private company the ability to turn the needle on stuff that changes entire media ecosystems at the country level. Country level. Okay? So when they started making these changes to the news feed, they tried them in several countries around the world. And traffic levels to, the Bosnian news sites or whatever it was, went down by half. Just overnight. Right? Whole countries' news ecosystems were turned upside down because they were testing this stuff out. I think we should be uncomfortable with any company having that level of power and control. And their scale makes them unique in this space. We've talked about them so much. I just want to underscore this point because it's really important. When people talk about social media, they talk about Twitter, Instagram, and blah, blah, blah. They're all rounding error compared to Facebook in terms of the audience size and influence. And Facebook's scale just drives this stuff, right? There's plenty of misinformation on Twitter too, but it's reaching a fraction of the people. And so we tend to worry about it much less. Yes, sir. Yes, yes, right. So if you're worried, things to worry about. They didn't believe the real news much either. Here, yes, that's right. Potentially. So media trust has been low for a long time. I've done a series of polls with co-authors on how much people trust in the media, and the answer is not very much. It's actually gone up since the 2016 election, if that encourages you. But that's driven by Democrats being excited about the media covering Trump critically. It's not an overall increase across parties. I'm not sure we're ever going back to the high point of media trust where Walter Cronkite was supposedly this person that all Americans trusted and so forth. That was a very unique set of historical circumstances that I don't think is replicable. But I do think we should worry about the super corroded information environment of the Russias of the world where no one knows what to believe is true. And that's the worry I have about the presence of fake news, but also the hype of it, right? So the presence of fake news, right? You get burned and you start distrusting everything you see a little bit more. That's really worrisome. But what's even more worrisome is you tell people there's fake news everywhere, there's fake news everywhere. And they start distrusting real news. Now, my students and I did an experiment where we showed people a general warning, watch out, there's fake news out there. And we did find they thought fake news that they later saw was a little less accurate, but they also thought the real news they saw was a little less accurate. So I think there's real reason for concern here, especially given the prevalence of the two, right? If people's mental model of this is half the stuff they're seeing out there is fake, and it's actually 2% or 1%, right? we're encouraging them to misapply this kind of fear to legitimate content. It doesn't mean that everything from mainstream news organizations is actually accurate, far from it, or that we shouldn't be skeptical. Of course we should, right? But I do think we need to take really seriously the potentially corrosive effects of driving, of the fear around this stuff. Let me give you another example. You guys have heard of the so-called deepfake videos? Okay. Have you ever seen a deepfake video in politics in this country? That anyone believed in this country? There was like a fake Obama one people did to dramatize a threat, but a real one that had some effect. No, zero, right? Okay, but you've all heard about them. So the worry, there's a similar kind of story you can tell there, right? It's not like we already have doctored audio and pictures, right? It's not like you don't trust any audio or any pictures anymore. But if we tell people video is fake, 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 right? It becomes easier to worry or to dismiss the legitimacy of real video, right? And so there's a similar sort of story there where the threat to our trust, the threat of deepfakes, I think, is outstripped by the threat to our trust in real video. Okay? And so we need to really think carefully about these kind of second-order effects, rather than just assuming that running around scaring people saying the sky is falling is the right approach. Yes, sir, you've had your hand up in the back. Yes, please. No, so yeah, so let's be clear about what's new. I think it's an important question. What I would say is lying and deception and false statements are inherent to democracy, and we need to make our peace with that. I think one of the distortions that's taken place in the debate after this is the idea that we need Facebook to eliminate all false claims in our politics. False claims are inherent to democracy, and the only way to get rid of them is to empower a kind of authoritarian control over the political debate that no one should want or be comfortable with. So I don't think that's the right goal. And I think you're right. There have always been false claims in politics. So what's new about fake news? Right? It's not even that there have been never been publishers publishing bogus stuff too. The 19th century and the 18th century, for instance, are full of dubious claims printed in dubious newspapers. Right? For instance, right? The thing I would say here is the barriers to entry are so low and the levels of partisanship are so high and the information travels so quickly that that combination is powerful and worrisome. Okay? That people all around, Facebook has essentially created this audience that can be monetized. You could be making 5 figures in a week if you stood up a really effective fake news site with very little effort or skill, potentially. Right? Because some of these sites are very bad, I'll be honest with you. Right? I'm actually kind of offended at how dumb they think we are by how bad these sites are. And I worry that if they actually had better people working for them, it would be much more effective. So it's all to say, I think that what's new about this is speed, the profit motive, and the high levels of partisanship intersecting, and social media allowing you to disseminate this site to the world very quickly. But I take your point that this is not a wholly new phenomenon. Oh yeah, but the reporting suggests that most of these folks aren't trying to change our politics. They're just trying to make money, right? And in some ways, that's even more worrisome because it suggests they'll be much more adaptive. And some of them may have already shifted to health, fake news, and all sorts of other stuff. But maybe they'll go off and do something socially productive instead. I mean, this is a very kind of waste of human capital, right? You guys have heard of the teenagers in? Remind me of the country. Macedonian teenagers, yes. Right? Very talented young people in Macedonia with good internet access and bad job opportunities who started making fake news websites. There's like Silicon Valley of fake news in this area in Macedonia that had like 200 of these sites, right? So, it would be great if those folks could have a more kind of socially productive revenue instead of creating this stuff. But we've made it profitable for them, right? And I'd say that's an area where I think the burden on the social media companies is much greater, right? Politicians have always said false things and they always will. That's not the social media company's responsibility, that's politics, okay? It's different when foreigners are entering our political debate solely to make money enabled by the distribution provided by social media companies. That's a phenomenon that is an artifact of our technology and not a kind of inherent part of our democratic debate. Yes, please.
Is there any kind of data on the ways in which real news or mainstream news has benefited from the proliferation of fake news? So it was kind of hard, not to notice immediately after the 2016 election how many various news sites were marketing the fact that they are truth tellers.
Right.
In contrast. So I was just curious about the ways in which, if we have any sort of information about the ways in which they've sort of benefited financially or reputationally from this.
It's an interesting question. So again, the first thing I would say is that the democratic trust in the news has gone up a lot. I think the story you're telling applies most directly to the sites that have been trying to make digital subscription models work and have recognized brands. So the New York Times and the Washington Post, for instance, have expanded quite successfully their subscription products. And one of the ways they've marketed them is to say, this is legitimate news you should invest in, not just for your own knowledge, but for the kind of social good. Right? I think that pitch works. The problem is it only funds a few national brands. Right? Local newspapers are dying all around us. And a lot of the worst corruption and other things that we want the press to expose is happening at the local and state level. And to my knowledge, this hasn't benefited those kinds of media outlets in any way. If anything, the problem has gotten worse. They're continuing to, close at a very rapid clip. So I worry that the response to this by mainstream news organizations is consolidation among a few, around a few national brands, and everything else still withering away. In the back, sir.
So the law professor in me tends to think about policy solutions, or try to, but I teach the First Amendment class, so I worry about government regulation of, freedom of speech. And so I'm curious. I mean, one good news story of your talk is that don't panic. It's not necessarily as bad as it might be. On the other hand, you have pointed out to serious concerns, and you've expressed concerns about the role of Facebook has, Barnes have. So can I get you a little bit out of your kind of comfort zone to think about policy recommendations that you might have all of us think about?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. So the first thing is, embarrassing self-advertisement. I have a column that just went up on Medium today about that exact point. So I've been thinking about this. I think the first step is to slow down. So countries around the world are making policies to stop fake news that often will have potentially serious unintended consequences or result in, I worry, illiberal suppression of speech. So I do think we need to slow down, and I do think we need to worry a lot about the First Amendment. I'm very uncomfortable with the government or private companies being empowered to act as a kind of fact censor at scale. There are various models that are being developed that I think are not policy as such, but at Facebook scale, everything they do is policy. So I would just say one thing we have to do is think about what policy means when there's a global behemoth at that scale. There are content moderation farms all over the world now where policy is being implemented in terms of what you see on Facebook and other social media platforms. So a lot of what's happening, there's already policies being implemented. They're just not being made by government. And we need to think about how we feel about that. Right now, in some cases, it's very clear, right? Violence, child pornography. There's a list of things that there's a complete social consensus that they should remove immediately and is uncontroversial. Okay, but some of this stuff gets very tricky very quickly, and I think we should be really uncomfortable with the way we're rushing towards either legal remedies for political speech we don't like, or empowering private companies to make those decisions for us. I think in both cases, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of some pretty significant downsides. So in Germany, for instance, the reporting suggests Facebook now has an army of lawyers on call to review anything that might run afoul of their Holocaust denial laws. the list goes on, but I'm not sure. I'm just not sure that we want anyone deciding those things for us. And again, I worry that the bar that's been set now is basically that if there is false content on Facebook, Facebook is responsible for it. And again, I think that's the wrong model. So there's experiments going on, kind of hybrid models. So if you guys have followed this debate at all, Facebook now has a partnership with third-party fact checkers. If third-party fact checkers flag a story as false, Facebook will downrank it. And that's at least a nice compromise where there's a kind of a third-party, a neutral third-party expert making this judgment rather than Facebook itself. Okay? There may be other kinds of intermediate steps we could take to kind of throttle the worst excesses of social media that don't require such direct and draconian interventions. WhatsApp, for instance, has been which is a messaging app, a private messaging app, has been really important in circulating misinformation in other countries around the world. It's not as big here. And as a result of the way it circulated misinformation in countries like Brazil, Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, has now limited how many people you can forward a story to 5. It used to be 30. And it's kind of throttling back the ability for misinformation on that platform to disseminate very widely, very quickly. Now, could you make policy about that? I suppose. I'm not sure I want Congress weighing in on how many people you can forward a message to. That doesn't seem like their comparative advantage. So I think we need to proceed really slowly. Now, this is a complex issue, and there's a bunch of manifestations of it, right? If you're worried about the Russian interference, of course. We already have laws on the books against foreign interference in elections. We already have laws on the books against hacking. If you're worried about Facebook ads, we can talk about transparency and disclosure in Facebook ads. But a lot of this strikes me as stuff that just there isn't a direct policy solution to. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Is it more of the case of Macedonia who are doing it for profit, or is it the actors, like international actors or other people who are doing it, like you said, maybe more to influence elections or to change the discourse of democracy? Is it both? Is there any of the data that you provided about the fake news that people consume? Is it primarily which of those is different?
That's a great question. So the data that I've shown you is websites people visited, and these are overwhelmingly, according to the reporting, profit-oriented. Now, this depends on people's self-reports of their motives, which, of course, maybe they actually are trying to influence the election. But there's pretty good evidence, actually, that some of these folks were trying pro-Clinton and pro-Trump fake news, which indicates they didn't really care, and they just went with what performed better. And in 2016, pro-Trump fake news performed better. It drew better, larger audiences. It circulated more widely on Facebook and so forth. It's also consistent with the backgrounds of a lot of these folks, the Macedonian teenagers, people who, there's a guy in Denver who got laid off from his job and started doing this instead. A lot of the reporting is not professional political operatives. Now, are there people doing this for influence? Well, there is dubious content being made for political influence. The Russian information operations, which we haven't talked about and which our data don't speak to, were overwhelmingly on Facebook itself. So I can't say to you very much about the Russian influence operations. Why? Because they didn't care about monetizing traffic. They didn't need to drive people off Facebook. The easiest way for them to reach lots of Americans was to put stuff on Facebook. So most of what they did was native to Facebook itself. That's not totally true. There's other stuff they did on Twitter and so forth. But a lot of the way they reached the most people was via stuff that was native to Facebook itself. Now, to what extent they were trying to support Trump versus promoting controversy, there's evidence of both kinds of actions on the platform. And there's some reports about this. Besides the Russian operation, though, I'd say the evidence of that stuff being done at scale in the US is relatively limited. That doesn't mean it's not happening around the world, though. So I would encourage us also to broaden the conversation. So the evidence in India, for instance, is that the BJP, one of the major parties there, has a kind of vertically integrated structure of WhatsApp information dissemination, where they have literally like a group in your village that gets orders from higher levels of like what the party message is and disseminates it out to the WhatsApp groups of everyone who lives there. So they're literally setting up this massive network of WhatsApp kind of distribution so that they can push their message out. The BJP has an app that they use that they want to get people to sign up for to pump this stuff out directly. I've talked to people who've sat with party workers and they have like 100 cell phones because you can only forward to so many people. So they have 100 cell phones and they just go phone to phone, right? So this may be the world we're heading towards, right? Now some of this may just be democracy, right? Maybe this is politics adapting to new technology, just like they adapted to TV and radio and direct mail and everything else. But I do think that there is the potential, if you saw what Russia did, to say, wow, Russia spent almost nothing on that. And they got a lot out of it, right? I don't think they changed, the evidence isn't convincing that they changed the election result either. But boy, we're still arguing about it. If their goal was to polarize us and make us hate each other, right? That operation went great, right? And it cost a fraction of one fighter jet, right? So if you're countries around the world, what might you take away from that? So I do worry about other kinds of influence operations that people might be inspired to undertake, given what we've seen so far, and the vulnerability of our platforms to them. Yes, and then you, yeah.
In the age of technology, obviously the profit model for a mainstream media company is to be the first to report something. So I guess my concern is they have the capacity of turning a news story that only a few thousand people would see by reporting it. And to give an example with the Covington Catholic kids, how the right and the left of the mainstream media both picked up on that and then ended up being highly misleading. So they then turn a story from only a few thousand people seeing it into tens of millions of people seeing it. And then they only spend a little time kind of correcting it. They spend 2 days talking about it. So how can, I guess, we hold them more accountable?
Yeah, that's a great point. So speed is bad not just for fake news dissemination, but for early and sometimes misleading reports, right? So a disturbing amount of mainstream news coverage is I saw this thing on Twitter and I typed it up, right? And often those early reports on Twitter turn out to be incomplete or misleading in various ways, as we saw with that case, where everyone has their different perspectives on it, but you should really read the reporting from day 2 and day 3 and day 4, which are much more complex and nuanced as far as what actually happened. And how we can hold them accountable for it is tricky. I mean, they're playing in this information economy that rewards attention and outrage, right? And those kinds of stories are great at generating it. And the boring, complex story that doesn't confirm anyone's predispositions quite as cleanly as those initial reports gets much less attention. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The incentives are affecting the mainstream companies too. Yeah, yes, sir.
Your story is really, this is being caused by the ability to provide amongst young people in Macedonia and the nature of business. And I'm wondering if the cause of this isn't starting with political campaigns and people who want to influence things. I wonder if we can compare the content on these fake news sites with the content of political ads and action on television. Because television is more regulated, right? But I live in a swing state here, and when election season ramps up, we see a lot of TV ads that go pretty far, claiming someone's a murderer or whatever. But they're pretty out there in terms of the news spin. I won't call it fake, I don't know what to call it. But there's a lot. It doesn't seem to be coming from the bottom up. It seems to be directed from, I don't know who, maybe not a campaign particularly, but certainly the elite who want this out in that direction. So I'm wondering if it's not more of a top-down phenomenon. This is the tool, not the cause. And another big player in this is government. You mentioned this. It's interesting that you spent an hour telling us this fake news is way overblown, but except that in 2 seconds, the Russians had a huge impact.
Oh no, I don't think they have a huge impact. They reach many people. No, they reach many people. The most credible estimates. Let's separate 2 things. I was talking about the for-profit fake news sites. The Russians reached, at least briefly, according to the estimates from Facebook, 120 million people. The evidence that they changed the outcome of the election is not credible, in my judgment. And we can talk about the reasons for that. But it's a very similar story. Most of what people saw from the Russians was for 2 and 5 and 12 seconds. The cumulative effect relative to all the other political news and information they received, I would submit, is relatively limited. But let's go back to your earlier point.
And a week doesn't go by that here in 2019 they're advertising the Pentagon Papers, right? And you might think that's irrelevant. What the Pentagon Papers really are, right, is an expose of how you can't believe what you're being told by the government. And I've had my entire last 40 years of my lifetime, there's been a steady erosion or continual media pointing out that what you're hearing, the
Sir, I mean, we're not going to be able to adjudicate the overall accuracy of everything the government says. I would say certainly there's lots of examples of things that government says are false. There's no credible evidence this is some sort of a top-down information operation, and I would suggest that the lesson of the post-Nixon, post-Vietnam system is how hard it is to conceal almost anything, let alone carry out giant conspiracies without us finding out, right? The government can barely order pencils without screwing it up, right? So I'm not sure they can carry out these large operations. Let me just finish the point, though. So the point I'd like to make, though, is just what I would suggest to you instead is if you're seeing overlap in the kinds of topics that these sites publish with mainstream content or attack ads or whatever, I think that's absolutely true. I would submit to you instead, though, that's more of a kind of decentralized adaptive response. So you imagine you're a political campaign. You're trying to figure out what messages work, what messages resonate. You're kind of searching and testing out different messages. The fake news publishers were doing the same exact thing. They were optimizing something different. They weren't optimizing votes. They were optimizing dollars. But they were seeing what performed on Facebook. They'd write an article about this, an article about that. Sometimes they would take things from the news and just type it up. And if there was some particular moment that outraged people on cable, they would repackage it into an article. And so you can get this convergence that doesn't reflect any sort of top-down conspiracy, but instead just what people care about and what they feel really strongly about. We have time for one more? All right. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a lot about Facebook as a specific source for how the fake news circulates and everything. But what are the risks involved with the other social media platforms? Do you think those become greater risks as time goes on?
That's a good question. So I would say I think Twitter is important because of the role it plays in elite discourse and journalists, including both politicians and journalists. So when I'm worried about Twitter, it's a kind of assignment desk for the media, like we were talking about earlier with Covington. And it's a way, when we were talking about this point, the gentleman raised in the back earlier about this kind of bank shot into politicians, a way that they can sometimes be reached with dubious content and help to amplify it. So that's what I worry about most with Twitter. It's not a kind of mass medium, but a lot of really influential folks are on there who have big audiences. As far as the other social platforms, it remains to be seen. I would say right now, the incentives to go after them and devote a lot of resources to operations on those, whether you're trying to make money or influence people, are pretty limited just because their reach is pretty small. One thing we don't have a sense of yet is how much of this is Facebook's massive scale. If every social media site was 10 to 20% of the population, right? Would any of them be as attractive, or even a fraction as attractive as Facebook is now, right? And I don't think we know. That's unlikely to change, though, and I'll just conclude with this point. As we build up this elaborate infrastructure around Facebook, we are setting them up to be a dominant player for decades into the future. We're kind of building an implicit policy infrastructure around them to make it very hard for any other site to compete. Imagine there is a competitor to Facebook that arises in the future. If we demand this level of content moderation and blah, 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 blah from them, it'll be very hard for anyone to compete. And so we run the risk of entrenching them for a long time. And again, that's going to give them a lot of influence over our politics. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you guys very much. It was fun to talk to you.